next, we have a session on breaking the gender bias, focusing on gender equality, diversity, and inclusion by SENELA JAYASURIYA. SENELA is the founder and CEO of Women Empowered Global. Over to you, SENELA, for your session.
Thank you so much, Aparna, and to Santosh and the amazing organizers who are behind today's fantastic event. What a wonderful event. All right, just to confirm, you see my slide and I'm audible?
Yes, perfectly, yeah.
All right, fantastic. So hi, everybody, an absolute pleasure to join you today at this wonderful summit. So a little bit about me. I'm a leadership expert with a background in brand development and innovation. And having worked in a Fortune 100 company myself, I really get to work with aspiring women in leadership and middle management to help them create magnetic personal brands without expensive PR agencies. And I also teach professionals around the world how to fast track their career without spending years climbing the corporate ladder. I'm also the founder and CEO of Women Empowered Global. I'm also the founder of 1 Million Women in Power, as well as an innovation coaching consultancy global business. Today, I'm so excited to focus on talking about sustainable business practices as it relates to specifically breaking the gender bias as it relates to women's equality, gender equity. As you know, just hearing about my profile, my background, and the kind of work I do, it's common sense to see why I'm so passionate about this SDG focus, which is SDG 5. So looking more in depth into the kind of work that we do at Women Empowered Global, it's an organization I founded because as a founder, I noticed a gap in the system, which was needed for women to thrive, specifically in the marketplace, more impactfully, and increase the representation of women in decision-making roles. Hence, I founded Women Empowered Global, which is a global organization that empowers women around the world through education, career advancement, and entrepreneurial programs with a network reaching over 40 countries across 6 continents. Now, I want to give credit to the amazing global team that has been supporting me. If you wonder, the kind of work I do in the space of DEI and the impact we're making as a global organization, Women Empowered Global really is an ecosystem. And you've heard the phrase, no woman is an island. It takes a village. And Women Empowered Global is certainly a global community of women and allies in tech, innovation, business, corporate, and nonprofit sectors, building strong bonds, brands, and businesses. So these are focus pillars. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the areas I specialize in is specifically lending to gender parity and women's equality. And it's so wonderful to see that even in today's summit, we have representation of so many different cultures, so many different industries, and that gets me excited. So I want to emphasize the importance of founders driving sustainable development goals through best practices and why sustainability is important to business success with respect to the domain and industry sector. Because as leaders, we come with influence. And if not us, then who? And if not now, then why? That is my mantra, even in leadership. And I tell this to people. And we talk so much about the change we want to see in this world in our lifetime. As human beings, we have a tendency to hold everyone else to a very high standard, isn't it? We appraise and praise business models that talk a lot about the triple bottom line, as it were. We love to hear business models that talk about people, planet, and profit. But then again, pointing fingers back at ourselves. I think it's an interesting thing to think about the difference between a leader who holds positional and situational power and authority versus a conscious leader who operates out of authenticity and trust. So I want to talk more about the problem, the challenge we have as it relates to gender parity and gender equity. A quote by Alan Watts: "There is a price to be paid for every increase in consciousness, but we cannot be more sensitive to pleasure without being more sensitive to pain." I want you to think about that. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I truly hope my presentation will give you more awareness and nuance about the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to gender equity and women's equality, and the need to together break that bias and explore meaningful, sustainable best practices, which I will be sharing with you as we go along. So let's first understand, to those new to this concept or new to this language, SENELA, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? What does it mean? Let me tell you. Diversity, equity, inclusion is a term used to describe at a policy level or at a systemic level or at a grassroots level initiatives that promote the representation of different groups of individuals, including people of different races and ethnicities, ages, abilities, who are differently abled, perhaps, genders, religions, cultures, and identities. That's what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about. The more diverse workforce, what we advocate for is the more inclusive workforce, what we advocate for is the more innovative workforce for better yield. Now, what do we mean by gender bias exactly? There are so many different biases out there. To name a few, in fact, we just concluded a 4-part series on unconscious bias at our 1 Million Women in Power forum we run every Friday with leaders from around the world discussing bias, because it's a huge area. We have implicit bias as well as conscious bias. Now, again, let me help you understand more about what type of biases are out there. You might relate and resonate with some of these at a conscious level and also at a subconscious level as a founder and in leadership. You get things like affinity bias, confirmation bias, conformity bias, which runs through a cultural narrative and the compliance narrative as well. Then you get the halo effect, and what that means is, for example, having a sharply dressed co-worker who might be judged to be more competent just purely based on how they match their colored tie to the shirt, or their clothing to the handbag, based on how sharply dressed they are. That's the halo effect. And also you get the gender bias, of course, which is the prefix of my presentation today. And then also, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, ageism, age bias is also a thing. Oh, he's too young for leadership. She's too young for leadership. She's too young to put into on a board position in a VC. As a venture capitalist firm, we can't recruit somebody into our board who's that young, who doesn't really fit the more elderly, oldest, age stereo bracket. So I want you to think about this. Then you have things like unconscious biases around name bias, believe it or not, beauty bias, height bias, crazy as it might sound, non-verbal bias. That's the non-verbal cues, how you're standing, your postures, people are interpreting your behaviors, your personality based on your physical projection, your non-verbal cues, believe it or not. Then authority bias, and also the overconfidence bias. I mean, this blows my mind when I think about the impact and influence that unconscious bias can have when it comes to decision-making, hiring, and that sort of thing. So I want you to be mindful today as a founder connected to this summit today. So I want to look at this global study I came across, friends, and that suggests that in this global study they conducted specifically around gender, it suggests a very startling revelation. Now, they conducted this gender study around the world and came to a conclusion that approximately 90% of people tend to have a bias against women. And this 90% composites not just the men, but also the women. Even women have bias against women. Think about this. Right? Because insight is clarity. Insight gives awareness. From awareness is when we get into action planning and how we can make changes for the better. So globally, close to 50% of men said they had a more right to a job than women. Now, that could attribute itself to so many different things. It could be the cultural narrative, it could be the upbringing, it could be the nature, nurture, mix of things, it could be the company culture, just different narratives there. But I'm just throwing out data points for you, which will build the business case, the humanitarian case, the sustainability SDG lens of a case to say, hey, it's a human right issue here. And as I go along, you will also learn that it's also an economic right to a company to have more gender parity at decision-making levels and across the board. Then in this study, they also included that women in political roles, there is a gender gap there as well. According to this report, about half of the world's men and women feel that men would make better political leaders. Think about that. Then I can go on. Women in the labor market. Women are paid less than men and are much less likely to be in senior positions. Globally, hear this, 40% of people thought men are better suited as business executives. Think about this. I want to reinforce this further to tell you, what's really happening out there, because perception also influences decision making. I want you to think about that as founders in the room today. So how can we then reduce this gender gap? It makes absolute economic sense. There's a powerful business case here to reduce gender gap, to break that gender bias. World Economic Forum published data that suggested that companies with more women on boards perform better. Companies with strong female leadership delivers over 30% higher return on equity. But why are we still seeing this gap? Women in the workplace, let me tell you about the problem. Research suggests that more than half of the women at the VP level had a tendency to hold staff roles, not line roles. What are line roles that are occupied predominantly by men? Line roles are those positions with direct responsibility to profit and loss in a business. Line roles are the positions in companies, in any scale, that get succession into decision-making positions. Now, that is where ideally we need an equal representation, and we need more gender diversity, we need more women populated. But unfortunately, we can see that about 2/3 of women in large companies start in these line positions, but subsequently, C-suite, when they reach C-suite, it gets reversed back into staff roles. Now, this is data insight for you. This is to create awareness. There is an absolute business case to break that bias as it relates to gender, and we need to see more diversity in decision-making capacity. So as the quote suggests here, if we truly want to hold hands on this mission to talk about sustainability, sustainable SDG 5 practices as it relates to closing this gender gap, challenging those destructive narratives, we need to look at what these gaps are. You get the degree gap when it comes to the academia side, you have the employment hiring gap, you have the retention gap, you have the founders gap, less women are in decision-making positions in VCs. Then you have the gender pay gap. On average, a woman in STEM earns 87% of what a man earns. Then talking about the retention gaps, women seek promotions less, they have succession less, they often stall in lower level positions and feel stagnant in careers. So I want you to think about that. So what are some solutions? What are some best practices? Reskilling, and that big fraction of women who leave the workforce to take care of the family and their children, how do we reskill them and get them back into the workforce? Powerful. That's sustainable as a best practice. How can we think about that? Then talk to women and girls and engage them more in policies and forums like this. How can we stop child marriage? Did you know that 1 in 5 girls are still married under 18 years in our generation? Think about that. This is happening before us. Raise aspirations of girls and parents. I know a lot of the South Asia regions, right? By and large, baby girls are raised to get married. Baby boys are raised to start a business. There's a paradigm shift there. Educate the parents, get women more into power positions. And as founders, we have a responsibility to be the change we want to see. And not just focus on results, but also focus on net contribution and impact. So in closing, ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to remind you is a powerful call to action. I don't like to end keynotes unless I've given a very powerful call to action. And I like to call this my 4 C's as it relates to sustainability as founders connecting around the world. Number 1, the first C, get clarity on how you can sharpen your lens on sustainability. Transformation starts with self-awareness. As a founder, go out there, do an audit on your own business, do an audit on your leadership decision making. How many of them include the SDG? Think about that. So get clarity. Number 2, choose to challenge the status quo. Number 3, look at collaborations that would be a strategic fit to enhance your goals as a founder on sustainability. And finally, number 4, communicate and gain clout from your key stakeholders to make that sustainable difference. So in closing, I want to leave you with this beautiful Dalai Lama quote: love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. If you want to learn more about implementing DEI programs in your organization, designing a DEI performance matrix, feel free to connect with me. You see the QR code above to the right, and I would love to hear from you. And with that, I pass the talking stick back to the wonderful Aparna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, SENELA, for that very informative and powerful session about breaking the gender bias. I hope this makes our listeners realize and think about the biases they have, especially their unconscious bias against women. As women, we all have faced it at some point or another, and we have failed to make people understand it is a bias that is working. Let's start working together to break this bias, because as you quoted rightly, if not we, then who? If not now, then when? What a powerful statement. This is what makes us go on every day as we wake up. Thank you so much, SENELA, for that very powerful presentation.